So now that you have kind of a little background on Freud's, self-congratulatory and aggrandized sort of theorizing about what people are like, uh, don't want to give too much credence to these ideas, but it is useful to have an understanding of what they are because they informed things moving forward. And you've probably heard of Freud's theories about the structure of personality and how these different impulses and ways of constraining ourselves and restraining ourselves interact. So you've probably heard of the id, the ego, and perhaps the superego. So, what are these different things? The id to Freud is basically your wants and your intense desires, your sexual and other biological drives. And this is, according to Freud, your innermost core of personality is where all your psychic energy comes from. You have no direct access to it. At all. It's totally unconscious, and it operates according to something called the pleasure principle, meaning I want pleasure now, gratification immediately, sexual, whatever it happens to be, gratification now. And the id cannot and does not think about norms, things in society, environmental realities. It's just saying, I want pleasure and gratification immediately. So that's not enough to, make a functioning person, right? So there are other parts that kind of mediate how the id interacts with the environment. The first is the ego, which is sort of your rational or decision making side. This is the one that has to think about, well, is it possible for me to get this type of gratification now? And this one is something that is conscious and comes along later in life. So think about a baby. All babies are doing are trying to get relief and gratification. They have no control over anything going on. They cry because they just want what they want. Eventually, an ego develops that starts to realize, I have to be able to navigate the world to get gratification. So how do I do that? So this is in some ways similar to, the central executive idea in working memory. The ego is trying to figure out how to put things together in the environment and succeed at things. Now, a third one is the superego. And this is kind of a more complex, higher level sort of way of thinking. It has to do with morality. Not only how can I get what I want, like the ego would try to think about with the id, how do we get something to satisfy the id? The superego is thinking about norms and rules and morality. How can I get what I want by operating within the laws and not offending or alienating people? What sorts of rules are relevant to me based on my role, my culture, my society. So this is still something trying to control the impulses of the id, but it's trying to do it in a morally righteous way, essentially. So you might find this graphic I had on a previous slide also useful, but the id is saying, I want it now. The ego is saying, I need a bit of planning to get it. And the superego is saying, you can't have it, it's not right. So these are some ways that these interact. Again, this is based on no evidence whatsoever, but it is perhaps a useful way to think about some things from our experience. And it's, Freud was building it based on what he heard from people and what he theorized about, himself too. Again, not based on theory, but a useful set of ideas. It's important, again, to remember that the id is supposedly operating totally unconsciously. You don't have direct access to these drives, and it doesn't have direct access to the world. The ego and the superego are sort of spreading across all modes of awareness. They're in your consciousness, they're in your preconscious, and they're in your unconscious. And again, this does not have specific evidence for it, but this is an early set of ideas about unconscious desires and associations that really informed a lot of the ways we think about implicit unconscious ideas today. Freud also suggested that our behaviors are driven by the interactions between these different parts of your personality, because if it gets too contentious, if that war inside you between what you want, what you need to do to get it, and what's right and wrong causes too much tension, then you become anxious. And we want to reduce that anxiety because no one wants to feel that. We want to feel normal and good. And the way we do this is by these things that Freud called defense mechanisms. And I'm going to just talk really quickly about 8 of them. We don't need to go into too much detail about them, but I think it's useful to think about how these might kind of work. So one that's very familiar in Freudian thinking is the idea of repression. We talked in memory about how repressed memories that suddenly resurface in therapy, like that doesn't really seem to happen. There's not a lot of evidence for that, but the idea for that comes in large part from Freud. So repression, pushing down your traumas and problems and impulses specifically, or even more so, to keep them from, bothering you, essentially. So you don't even remember them. Denial, just ignoring things about your environment, denying they exist or affect you. And it might have to do with, well, I don't feel bad about that, or just denying the event altogether. Displacement has to do with redirecting an impulse towards something else. So let's say you have an impulse to eat some really unhealthy food. You might displace that impulse towards something else, or displace your unacceptable sexual urges towards people that you could not have sex with, towards people that you could, perhaps displacing these sorts of impulses. Regression was Freud's idea about returning to an immature level of functioning. So people coping by, having a toothpick in their mouth or something like that is, in his ideas, regressing to your oral stage, where you're getting that psychosexual pleasure from some specific set of behaviors. Projection is when you are sort of putting your issues and impulses on other people. So, when you're maybe blaming someone for something that you yourself are doing, that might be projection. Rationalization, coming up with some big story about why you're doing something that, doesn't get to the actual impulse that you're trying to satisfy. Reaction formation, where you are kind of going in the other direction, that if you have maybe like not severe, but intense sexual urges, that you kind of take this in the opposite direction and just abstain totally from sex or self-pleasure or anything. So you're just going in the opposite direction of what your impulse is saying to, get rid of that tension from trying to satisfy that impulse. And sublimation, another way of kind of redirecting the impulse. So again, if it's something that is unacceptable, maybe you kind of take that impulse and reshape it and form it into something different, or towards some other target that is more acceptable. So again, some complicated ideas. You don't want to spend too much. I just want to give you examples of these. But all this stuff together, how can we evaluate this perspective? How useful is this? It's really hard to evaluate this because it's really difficult to study. All the things that Freud talked about, it's really difficult to nail down what he's talking about, because he uses different ways of talking about it all the time. These concepts do not lend themselves well to measurement, which is a hallmark of a bad set of theories and hypotheses, that you can't clearly define what it is that should be related. So because of this, it was very difficult to falsify, and Freud kind of contorted everything he observed into support for what he was saying, rather than actually trying to test it. So there's really not much empirical support for this perspective because of that. And it is difficult to falsify. There's not clear predictions you can make that you can say, well, if the psychodynamic perspective is correct, we'll observe this. If it's wrong, we'll observe this. It doesn't, you can contort anything to fit into this perspective. And we want things to be falsifiable to be good science, basically. So even though, again, I've already kind of said this stuff already, but even though this isn't based on much evidence, it did push us in some directions that ended up being helpful in the long run. Mainly, the unconscious does exist and does matter. We just need to measure it in different ways than Freud seemed to think. And our childhood experiences do matter a lot. They shape how our lives function going forward. Like when we talked about attachment with your primary caregiver early in life, that shapes sets the stage for the relationships you're going to have later on. But it just isn't the case that, like Freud seemed to think, pretty much everyone is repressing some kind of trauma that is shaping their lives, even though they can't remember it or don't have access to it. That's not really how it works. Traumas do matter and they do influence people, but it's not quite how Freud suggested. So let's talk about some other perspectives. Psychologists kind of reacting to Freud's ideas kind of went in the other direction. I've called this humanistic psychology in other places. Individual psychology is also a useful way to think about it, but trying to give people more agency in some ways and thinking about how people can grow and develop. Alfred Adler was a colleague of Freud's who kind of decided he was full of crap in the early 1900s and went off in his own ways. He suggested that rather than just being subjected to our weaknesses constantly, we respond to our weaknesses and use them to improve and build strengths. So everyone wants to be the best they can be, according to Adler, and we're trying to address our shortcomings to improve ourselves and develop as people. However, you can do this in healthy ways and unhealthy ways. Healthy ways would be ways that improve you without hurting other people. But if you are trying to get ahead by hurting other people at the expense of other people, then Adler suggested that not only is that like a maladaptive and undesirable way of behaving, that constitutes, in his opinion, a type of mental illness. And in some ways, you'll see as we get to disorders and treatment later on, some mental illnesses do have this type of behavior as one of usually many symptoms. And Adler also suggested that if you are frequently trying to improve yourself to no success, then you might develop what he called, and we get this term from him, an inferiority complex. That you're not able to succeed, and you kind of get stuck in this self-defeating cycle of always thinking you're going to fail after a while. Taking this further in the humanistic direction, a researcher and clinician named Carl Rogers suggested basically that our personalities come from the fit between who we are and who we want to be. So people have a self-concept that they develop over time by observing their own behavior and thinking about the type of person that they want to be, but or the person that they are. But people also have ideal selves, the person we would ideally be, the person we want to be, sort of an aspirational self. And the fit between these things determines how well adjusted we are. If our self-concept is usually it's going to be in the worst direction because ideal selves are usually better than what we actually are. The bigger the gap here and the more we care about that gap and not meeting that idealized version of ourselves, the more distress we might feel. Essentially, that we have an idea of what we want to be, and if we can't reach it, then that can be distressing. Rogers suggested that in clinical settings, and early personality ideas come a lot from clinical psychology and thinking about disorders. And they didn't used to really be as separate as we treat them today, personality and disorders, even though there are some overlaps. But he suggested that clinicians should always be giving people unconditional positive regard, accepting them who they are rather than trying to change them. You should be helping improve their lives in ways that give them agency and allow them to choose. So this is a departure from Freud's ideas having to do with, that people have these problems that he needs to be able to fix, essentially. Another humanistic psychologist we've talked about a bit in the history and motivation chapter, so I won't spend too much time on this, but familiar name, Abraham Maslow, somebody who came up with this hierarchy of needs. Remember, we need to satisfy more basic needs like having food and water, then things about security, safety, shelter, then belonging and social needs and love, then esteem, feeling accomplished, and then once you have met those things, you can become self-actualized and fulfill your potential. And Maslow came up with these in, I wouldn't say as atheoretically as Freud, but he wasn't basing these on too much empirical evidence either. He was looking at successful people like Harriet Tubman and Abraham Lincoln, and trying to think of what do these admirable people have in common to figure out how we progress through our needs and reach that sort of self-actualized personality. So he thought about these not only as needs and goals, but as part of becoming a self-actualized person. And this makes an assumption. First of all, it makes the assumption that we go through these in this order, which isn't necessarily always true. And it makes an assumption as well that everyone's goal is this self-actualized personality, which I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it doesn't give people much freedom to choose what their ultimate goals for themselves are. So it is a little narrow in some ways, in addition to not necessarily being as clear on how we should go through these steps. So some ideas to evaluate here. Rogers' ideas. They're relying on people's personal experiences, and these things you can measure someone's ideal and actual self-concept and see the differences. So there are ways to kind of test these ideas that have received some support. Maslow's ideas, can't really test them. They're sort of Freudian in the sense that they're assumptions rather than things that came out of empirical evidence. Both of these ideas, though, do one good thing where they think, they give people agency over their problems. They say your problems are relying in yourself and your construal of what things are like in your life, not blaming it on other people. However, they aren't taking other important things into account. They're not really thinking about situations, the environment you grew up in and developed in. And sometimes you do need to think about how other people are affecting you rather than always taking full responsibility and focus on everything going on in your life. Okay, that kind of wraps up some of the idiographic things, and in the next video, I'll start talking about a nomothetic approach and talk about personality traits.